At 14, girls were already expected to marry, and by 15, many were expected to bear children. In a world where the roles of women were rigidly defined, the concept of childhood was fleeting, and adulthood arrived with brutal speed. For most women of the 14th to 18th centuries, life was a relentless cycle of birth, death, and survival, with little room for rebellion or personal desire. Their lives were dictated by forces beyond their control, and from a young age they learned that their value was tied to their ability to fulfill these roles. Imagine being thrust into marriage at an age when your body is not yet ready, your heart not yet fully developed, and your mind still grasping at the faintest shadows of what could have been your childhood. You have no say in your future, no control over who you marry, and certainly no voice in the way your life unfolds. The future ahead of you is not one of dreams, but of survival. Survival through the expected pains of childbirth and the endless cycle of child rearing. In a time when medicine was rudimentary at best, the dangers of childbirth were ever present, and death was a constant companion, often lurking just behind the birth of each new child. At 15, the expectations placed upon women were suffocating. If they survived the brutal act of childbirth, they were expected to repeat the process, year after year. A woman who could bear many children was seen as a valuable asset, but those who could not were often dismissed as failures. The very nature of womanhood was reduced to a series of physical functions: bearing children, maintaining a household, pleasing a husband. There was no room for individuality, for desires, or for the exploration of life beyond these narrow confines. The question of whether or not a woman would survive beyond her 30th birthday was one that hung over every marriage and every pregnancy. In an age when the average life expectancy was low, especially for women, living to 30 was a triumph. If a woman made it past the age of 30, she was considered fortunate. If she lived to see 50, she was often considered a rare anomaly. The average life expectancy for women was grim, and much of their lives were spent in the shadow of early death. This looming specter of mortality was something that haunted every woman, whether she was a young bride or a seasoned mother. If you've been moved by these powerful stories of resilience and survival, make sure you don't miss out on the next chapter. Hit that subscribe button and join a community of like-minded individuals who are passionate about learning from the past and creating a better future. Where are you watching from today? I'd love to know. But the true weight of a woman's existence in these centuries went far beyond the physical. The mental and emotional toll was perhaps even greater. Women were raised to believe that their primary worth was found in their ability to serve others, primarily their husbands and children. Their identity was swallowed by their roles. They were defined by their ability to reproduce, to maintain a home, to keep a husband happy, and to raise children who would grow up to perpetuate the family name. There was little room for self-expression, for intellectual pursuits, or for dreams of a life beyond the domestic sphere. To defy the system was to risk being branded as unnatural, even dangerous. There was a fine line between being a dutiful wife and mother and being perceived as a threat to the social order. Women who showed too much independence, too much of their own will, were often branded as witches or madwomen. In a time when the church held vast influence over society, anything that threatened the established norms could be seen as heresy. The very act of questioning your role in life, the very act of seeking something beyond the confines of marriage and motherhood, was enough to bring suspicion. Women were kept in check, not just by their husbands or families, but by the all-encompassing grip of religious and social expectations. The small victories, like managing to survive childbirth or maintaining a household through years of hardship, were often the only sources of fulfillment. The notion of personal achievement was foreign to many women. There was no recognition for intellectual accomplishments or career advancements. A woman's worth was measured solely by her ability to fulfill her prescribed roles, and any deviation from this was met with suspicion or outright hostility. As time passed, women began to find small ways to carve out pockets of autonomy. The work done in the home, such as weaving, sewing, and cooking, could offer a brief respite from the harsh realities of their roles. But even in these moments of personal accomplishment, women were never truly free. Their work was often closely supervised, and even the act of sewing could not be fully enjoyed without the looming knowledge that it was another way of fulfilling their duties as wives and mothers. The idea of personal freedom, freedom to choose a different path, to have a say in one's own life, was almost non-existent. Women lived in a world that constantly reminded them of their place in the social order. This silence was not always passive. Sometimes it was imposed through violence, both physical and psychological. The fear of punishment for stepping outside the boundaries of their roles kept women in check. But sometimes the silence was a form of resistance. In a world where speaking out could cost them everything, women found ways to rebel in small, hidden ways. Whether through whispered words between friends, hidden diaries, or subtle acts of defiance, there were moments when women managed to assert their will in a world that sought to crush it. These moments, however small, were the spark of resistance in a world that tried to strip them of their voice. And yet, these women endured. They survived the hardships, the expectations, and the limitations placed upon them. They continued to bear children, to care for families, to fight for their survival year after year, all while remaining largely invisible in the eyes of history. Their stories were often untold, their voices unheard. But in the shadows of their suffering, there was strength. There was resilience. And though history may have silenced them, their legacy lives on, quietly but powerfully. In the world of the 14th to 18th centuries, the life of a woman was not her own. Her name, her body, and her mind were owned by her family, her husband, and the church. Women were little more than vessels. Vessels for bearing children, vessels for carrying on family lines, and vessels for perpetuating a legacy that often never recognized them as individuals. Without education, without legal rights, and without an identity that belonged solely to them, women lived lives of quiet desperation, their personal desires drowned out by the weight of duty and expectation. The idea of personal freedom for women was, quite simply, unimaginable. They were born into a world that demanded complete submission to the authority of men. The lack of education was one of the primary ways society kept women in line. Most girls never learned to read or write, let alone study subjects like science, philosophy, or politics. Their education was confined to the domestic sphere: how to cook, how to clean, how to care for children, and how to please a husband. This was the extent of their intellectual and emotional growth, and for most, it was all they knew. In a society where women were not seen as capable of intellectual achievement, the idea that they might aspire to something beyond the home was both foreign and unacceptable. Imagine a young girl, perhaps no older than 12, realizing that her world was defined by the narrowest of boundaries. She was given no chance to explore the vastness of the world outside her household. Her value was determined by how well she could perform domestic duties, and her worth was linked to her ability to marry well and produce heirs. But what if, deep inside, she longed for something more? What if she had dreams that reached beyond the confines of her world? Those dreams were smothered quickly, for they threatened the very fabric of a patriarchal society that required women's silence, not their voice. Yet the most terrifying consequence of this lack of rights was the complete erasure of the woman's identity. Without the legal right to own property, to speak in public, or even to make decisions about her own body, a woman's life was lived in a perpetual state of invisibility. She did not own herself. Her father or husband held that ownership. Marriage was not an act of love. It was a transaction, a way to solidify social and economic power. In this world, the concept of a woman having a name was irrelevant. Her name was not important because she was seen only in relation to the men in her life, her father, her husband, or her brothers. To be recognized as a person with rights, a woman would have had to step outside the boundaries of everything she knew, which, for most, was a far too dangerous prospect. Her role was reduced to two primary duties: to marry and to bear children. From an early age, girls were taught that their worth was tied to their ability to perform these duties. There were no opportunities for self-actualization or self-exploration. There was no room for individual desires or goals outside of the domestic and maternal roles. To deviate from this path was considered unnatural, and those who did were often viewed with suspicion. A woman who showed independence or ambition beyond the household was seen as a threat to the social order, and so many kept their thoughts and desires hidden, buried deep within their hearts. Take, for example, the women who lived in the court of a nobleman. They were expected to adhere to strict codes of conduct, their behavior controlled by both social and religious rules. At court, they had little say in their own lives, and their fate was often decided by their family's political or economic ambitions. But even at court, they were not free. Women could be married off at any moment without their consent, and forced into alliances that held no regard for their happiness. If a woman married for love, she was often considered foolish, and her choice would be condemned by society as an act of rebellion. Marriage, however, was not a guarantee of happiness or safety. For many women, marriage was a life sentence, an ongoing battle for survival. Husbands held absolute control over their wives, and there were few protections for women who suffered from abuse or neglect. Even worse in some cases, a woman's worth was tied solely to her ability to bear children. If she failed to produce children, particularly male heirs, she could be cast aside, blamed for the failure of the marriage, and left in a position where she had no rights, no recourse, and no power. The system of patriarchy not only kept women in a state of subjugation, but also made sure they never felt capable of breaking free. Women were told that their lives had one singular purpose: to marry and have children. These ideals were reinforced by religious teachings that emphasized the sanctity of marriage and the natural role of women as mothers. The Catholic Church in particular held significant influence over women's lives, ensuring that their place in society was always subordinate to that of men. But what did this system leave behind for the women who were trapped within it? What was there to look forward to beyond the daily grind of domestic life? For many, the only escape came in the form of small, often unnoticed acts of resistance. Whether through whispered conversations with other women, hidden letters, or small rebellions in the privacy of their homes, women managed to carve out pockets of personal freedom. But even these small victories were fraught with danger. The threat of being labeled as a heretic, a witch, or an immoral woman was ever present. In many ways, this oppressive system served as a form of social control that kept women in check. It was not just a matter of controlling their bodies, but controlling their very existence. Women were kept invisible not only through physical means, but also through the suppression of their identities and desires. In a world where they were expected to serve others and keep their heads down, the idea of claiming a life for oneself was almost unthinkable. Yet, even in the darkest corners of their existence, there were sparks of light. Women found ways to resist, to assert their voices, and to challenge the status quo. These acts were subtle, often quiet, but they were powerful in their own right. Some women defied their expected roles in small ways, finding moments of freedom in their daily lives. Others took more direct actions, defying the norms of their time and seeking out ways to make their mark on history. But even in their resistance, women were constrained by the limitations of their society. They could never fully escape the roles imposed upon them, for society was quick to label them if they did. Whether through the guise of religious authority, legal constraints, or social norms, the world they lived in ensured that their voices were drowned out. Yet, in their silence, there was power. There was a strength that transcended the constraints of the time, a quiet resilience that still echoes today, reminding us of the women who lived, loved, and fought within a system that sought to break them. Their stories, though largely untold, remain etched into the very fabric of history. And as we look back at their lives, we cannot help but wonder, what if their voices had been heard? What if their dreams had been allowed to grow? What if their lives had been their own to define? In a world where women's lives were scripted from birth, where their identities were subsumed by the roles they were expected to fulfill, the notion of agency was nothing more than a distant dream. From the moment a girl was born, she was thrust into a world where her worth was determined by how well she could fulfill the duties of a wife and mother. The sheer magnitude of this burden left little room for personal choice, and the constant struggle between survival and subjugation marked the entirety of their existence. However, what truly made the system so unyielding was the overwhelming presence of religion and its deep entanglement with societal expectations. Religion wasn't just a belief system, it was the very structure that maintained the subjugation of women, keeping them firmly tethered to their homes and households. For women, the religious teachings of the time served as both a guide to how they should live and a hammer to keep them in line. Catholicism, with its rigid doctrines and emphasis on submission, was particularly pervasive. Women were taught from an early age that their primary role was to be a dutiful wife and a mother, devoted entirely to their families and the service of God. Marriage was seen as a sacred institution, and a woman's value was measured not by her intellect or personal accomplishments, but by her ability to fulfill this religiously prescribed role. Her duty to bear children, particularly male heirs, was not only an obligation, but also a form of religious sacrifice. To refuse or fail in this duty was seen as a sin, a violation of divine law. The pressure placed on women to conform to these religious expectations was immense. The church did not merely advise women on how to live their lives, it dictated their every move. The strict codes of conduct imposed on women included modesty in dress, chastity before marriage, and unwavering obedience to their husbands. Any deviation from this script was seen as a moral failing, a sin that required penance. Even women who found themselves in difficult or abusive marriages had little recourse. The church taught that women should endure their suffering quietly, for to question their husbands or assert themselves would be to question the divine order. Consider the women who found themselves in abusive marriages. They had no legal protection, and religious doctrine prevented them from seeking divorce, which was viewed as sinful. These women were trapped in a system that condemned them to a life of pain and submission. The church's teachings on the sanctity of marriage bound them to a man who could do as he pleased, with little consequence. A woman's voice was silenced, and her suffering was deemed a part of her spiritual journey, a cross to bear for the greater good. This doctrine was a form of spiritual imprisonment, where women were not allowed to claim their rights, their voices, or their agency. Even those who did not face the horrors of abusive marriages lived in a world where their lives were circumscribed by religious dictate. Women were expected to show devotion not only to their husbands, but to the church itself. They were told that their purpose was to serve both God and their families, and that their personal desires were secondary to these greater duties. The idea that a woman could have desires outside of her home, that she might seek fulfillment in areas such as education, travel, or personal achievement, was anathema to the teachings of the time. These notions were considered dangerous, rebellious, and even blasphemous. Women were confined to their homes, their roles as wives and mothers, and were told that their place in society was to support the men in their lives. The concept of motherhood, however, was one that was simultaneously exalted and devastating. While women were revered for their ability to bear children, the process of childbirth was fraught with danger. Life expectancy for women was low, and childbirth was one of the leading causes of death. The dangers of childbirth, along with the constant threat of disease, meant that many women would not live past their 30s. Even those who did survive the physical toll of childbirth were left with little opportunity for self-expression or personal development. They were expected to continue the cycle, bearing more children, caring for their families, and maintaining the household, all while sacrificing their own happiness and well-being for the sake of their families. For women of this time, the fear of dying in childbirth was ever present, but it was not the only fear they carried. The fear of being labeled as immoral, of stepping outside the boundaries set by society and the church, was perhaps even more terrifying. The slightest deviation from the prescribed norms could lead to accusations of witchcraft or heresy. The witch hunts of the time were a stark reminder of how dangerous it was to be a woman with a voice. Women who were seen as too independent, too outspoken, or too knowledgeable were often accused of witchcraft and subjected to brutal trials. Many women who sought knowledge, who dared to question the world around them, found themselves branded as witches. The very act of thinking for oneself, of having an opinion that diverged from the accepted narrative, was enough to draw suspicion. But there were those who found ways to challenge the system, even in small ways. Some women, through cunning and resourcefulness, were able to carve out spaces for themselves, where they could pursue personal interests or education. Others took more direct action, defying their prescribed roles and standing up to the tyranny of the system. These women, though often silenced by history, were the early rebels, the ones who dared to dream of a life beyond the narrow confines of their gender. Consider the women who became writers and intellectuals in a time when such pursuits were considered unacceptable for their gender. Though their work was often suppressed or ignored, their contributions to literature and philosophy would eventually be recognized as groundbreaking. Women like Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, who not only wrote extensively about theology and medicine, but also composed music that was ahead of her time. Women like Christine de Pizan, a 14th century writer, who advocated for women's rights and their education. These women were extraordinary, not just for their intellect, but for the sheer courage it took to defy a society that sought to keep them quiet. But for the majority of women, the path to personal expression and self-actualization was fraught with obstacles. The overwhelming societal pressure to conform to the rigid expectations of marriage, motherhood, and domesticity was all-encompassing. For most, it was simply a matter of survival. Women lived their lives in a constant state of compromise, sacrificing their personal desires and dreams for the sake of their families. The idea of personal fulfillment was a luxury that few women could afford. Yet, even in the face of this crushing reality, there were moments of defiance. These moments may have been small, and they may have been fleeting, but they were acts of resistance. Whether through quiet acts of rebellion within the home, the secret reading of forbidden books, or whispered conversations with other women, there were women who found ways to challenge the status quo. These women, though often overlooked in the annals of history, paved the way for future generations to challenge the oppressive systems that sought to silence them. And, while their voices may not have been heard in their time, their courage and determination continue to echo through history, inspiring the women of today to continue the fight for equality, justice, and freedom. The story of women from the 14th to the 18th centuries is often one of silence and subjugation, but buried beneath this heavy cloak of oppression lies a world of small victories, quiet resistances, and fierce struggles for survival. As the centuries passed, women began to find subtle ways to push back against the restrictive roles that were imposed on them, carving out moments of autonomy in a world that seemed intent on stifling their voices. Yet this struggle for independence was fraught with immense danger. To be a woman with too much freedom, whether in thought, action, or belief, was to risk being labeled as a heretic, a witch, or worse. The fear of punishment loomed large, casting a shadow over any attempt at defiance. But even within this fear, something remarkable began to happen. Women started to find ways to resist, albeit quietly, and in ways that the world often did not recognize. For many women, the home was both a sanctuary and a prison. It was where they were confined to their roles as wives and mothers, yet it was also where they had the potential to wield some semblance of power. In the private sphere, women could exert influence over their families, make decisions regarding the upbringing of their children, and sometimes even offer counsel on matters of governance. While the public domain was largely off limits to women, the home became a space where their thoughts and actions, while constrained, could be shaped by their own wills. Yet the boundaries of this private power were constantly being tested. Even within the home, the pressure to conform to societal expectations was overwhelming. Women were not allowed to speak out, to express opinions, or to question authority. To do so would mean risking not only their reputation, but their very existence within society. The fear of being branded a witch for any behavior that deviated from the prescribed norms was ever present. The witch hunts of the time were not just about hunting women who practiced magic. They were also about silencing any woman who dared to step outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior. In an era where women had little power, accusations of witchcraft were often used to punish those who spoke too loudly or resisted too strongly. The threat of being accused of witchcraft was an ever-present fear, especially for women who were seen as independent or too knowledgeable. The notorious witch trials, which peaked in the 16th and 17th centuries, serve as a grim reminder of how society dealt with women who were perceived as threatening. Women who were outspoken, who had knowledge of herbs and healing, or who simply dared to assert their opinions, were often labeled as witches. These women were subjected to horrific trials, often involving torture, and many were executed, sometimes in public burnings, meant to serve as a warning to others. The church played a pivotal role in these trials, sanctioning the idea that women who did not conform to the expected roles were dangerous. The result was a terrifying climate where women were forced into silence, their lives held hostage by the threat of accusation. Yet even in the face of this brutal repression, there were women who resisted, often in secret. One such example is the case of the famous midwife and herbalist, Elizabeth Cellier. In 1680, Cellier was accused of treason for her outspoken political views and for being associated with the Popish Plot, a fabricated conspiracy against the English monarchy. Despite the serious accusations, Cellier never backed down. She was one of the few women to publicly challenge the political and religious systems that sought to oppress her. Though she was eventually acquitted, her courage in the face of an oppressive system is a testament to the quiet resistance that many women, particularly those with knowledge or power, waged against the forces that sought to silence them. But it wasn't just the political or intellectual women who resisted the expectations of society. Even those in the most dire of circumstances found small ways to push back. Take, for instance, the women who worked as servants in the great houses and estates of the wealthy. While their lives were dominated by the oppressive demands of their employers, many found ways to assert some control over their existence. Some managed to escape, albeit temporarily, into relationships or romantic entanglements that offered them a brief reprieve from their harsh realities. Others took refuge in their relationships with other women, forming bonds that allowed them to speak freely, share knowledge, and even organize in secret. However, these small rebellions, though important, were often fraught with peril. Women who dared to act outside the bounds of societal expectations faced grave consequences. For those who found themselves in abusive marriages, the prospect of seeking help was almost non-existent. Women were taught that their suffering was not only a part of their role as wives, but that it was a divine trial, one they were meant to endure without complaint. The religious and social teachings of the time reinforced this view. The very act of asking for help or seeking a divorce was considered sinful. Women who attempted to free themselves from abusive relationships were condemned not only by their families and communities, but often by the church itself. The journey doesn't end here. There's so much more to explore together. Subscribe now to be part of our growing family, where we dive into stories that shape history and inspire change. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're tuning in from. I'm curious to hear your story. The lack of legal rights for women compounded their suffering. In many cases, the law sided with the husband, giving him the right to control every aspect of his wife's life. A woman had no claim to her own property or wealth. It was all considered the possession of her husband. A woman could not enter into contracts, own land, or even speak publicly without risking severe social and legal repercussions. In a society that viewed women as subservient to men, there was little to no support for women who sought to break free of the shackles imposed upon them. Yet, despite the suffocating control exerted over their lives, some women managed to carve out spaces of relative autonomy. Some found solace in the religious life, seeking refuge in convents where they could live away from the prying eyes of society. Convents offered women the opportunity to read, write, and engage in intellectual pursuits, all of which were otherwise denied to them. However, even these sanctuaries were not free from the pervasive control of the church, which often placed restrictions on the type of education or work that women could engage in. In many ways, convents became the last bastion of intellectual freedom for women, though this freedom was still tempered by the expectations of religious conformity. Women like Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, used their time in convents to write extensively about theology, science, and medicine, producing works that were ahead of their time. Her writings on natural history, medicine, and the relationship between the body and the soul challenged the rigid views held by the church. Women like Hildegard, though exceptional, represent a broader trend in which women, even under severe restrictions, found ways to resist the confining structures of their society. But even those women who did not have the opportunity to retreat to a convent found subtle ways to express their resistance. In their everyday lives, many women found ways to undermine the system in small, almost imperceptible ways. Whether through the clandestine sharing of knowledge or the creation of bonds with other women that allowed them to speak freely, women created networks of resistance that would, in time, grow into the powerful movements for women's rights that would take shape in later centuries. While the women of the 14th to 18th centuries were often silenced by societal, religious, and legal forces, their resistance was far from non-existent. It was present in the whispered words between friends, the secret letters passed between lovers, and the books written by women who defied the constraints placed upon them. Even in their darkest hours, women managed to assert their voices, laying the groundwork for future generations to continue the fight for freedom, autonomy, and equality. The legacy of these silent rebellions is one that continues to resonate today, inspiring women to resist the forces that seek to silence them and to reclaim their power in a world that is still learning to hear their voices. In the world of the 14th to 18th centuries, survival was often the most that women could hope for. Their lives were not just shaped by the constant demands of marriage and motherhood, but by a suffocating societal structure that dictated their every move. For most women, the idea of personal fulfillment was out of reach. Yet, amid the crushing weight of patriarchal oppression, there were those who found ways to persevere. Their resilience was not simply a matter of enduring the hardships of life, but also of subtly resisting the oppressive systems that sought to silence them. These women survived by finding ways to assert themselves, even within the confines of a society that seemed intent on erasing their voices. The notion of surviving another year was not merely about outliving the physical dangers of a childbirth or disease. It was about navigating the complex social and religious structures that sought to limit a woman's agency. A woman's life was constantly under surveillance, not just by her family, but by her community, her church, and society at large. Every action, every word, and every decision could be scrutinized, judged, and condemned. And yet, it was in this very environment of surveillance and control that women began to carve out spaces of resistance, even if those spaces were small, quiet, and often hidden from the public eye. Take, for example, the lives of women in rural communities. While the aristocracy had some degree of freedom, women in rural areas faced an even more brutal existence. They worked long hours in the fields, tending to crops and animals, and were responsible for nearly every aspect of domestic life. Yet, in this harsh environment, women often held a degree of power within their own households. They were the ones who made decisions about the family's day-to-day life, managing resources, maintaining the home, and raising children. Despite being isolated from the power structures of the aristocracy, these women found ways to assert themselves by becoming central figures in their communities. In rural communities, women often became the keepers of knowledge. They were the ones who knew the secrets of healing, the herbs that could cure ailments, the rituals that protected against evil. This knowledge was not just practical, it was also a form of power. The ability to heal, to help others, or to protect a family from harm was a form of resistance against the broader systems that sought to control women. It allowed women to take on roles as healers, midwives, and wise women, even if their positions were not officially recognized. In these spaces, women could exercise a degree of autonomy, as their knowledge was respected, even if it was often feared. But this power came at a cost. Women who wielded knowledge outside of the accepted norms, especially knowledge that had not been sanctioned by the church, were at risk of being accused of witchcraft. The fear of witches was pervasive throughout Europe, and women who were known for their knowledge of herbs, healing, or spiritual practices were often labeled as witches. The witch hunts, which peaked in the 16th and 17th centuries, targeted women who were perceived as threats to the social order. These women were often accused of using their knowledge for evil purposes, and many were tortured and executed. Despite the very real danger that came with possessing knowledge that was not sanctioned by the church, women continued to pass down their wisdom. The use of herbs and natural remedies became a way for women to assert their independence and resist the medical orthodoxy of the time, which was controlled by men. The medical establishment, dominated by male doctors and scholars, often viewed women's knowledge as inferior, even though the remedies they provided were often just as effective, if not more so, than those prescribed by male doctors. This resistance was not always direct or overt. For many women, it was simply about finding moments of agency in an otherwise controlled existence. Consider the women who worked as servants in the homes of the wealthy. Their lives were constrained by the demands of their employers, but they still found ways to express themselves. Many servants formed tight-knit communities, creating bonds with other women that allowed them to share their experiences and offer support. These relationships were critical for survival, as they provided emotional sustenance in a world that often sought to break their spirits. In these moments, the bonds between women became a source of strength, a way to resist the isolation and subjugation they faced on a daily basis. But it was not just the women in rural communities or domestic service who found ways to assert themselves. Women in the courts of monarchs and the aristocracy also navigated a complex web of power, influence, and survival. At court, women were expected to conform to the strict codes of behavior set by the monarchy and the aristocracy. They were expected to marry well, produce heirs, and manage their households with grace and efficiency. But these women were not mere pawns in the game of politics. They were players, wielding power in subtle ways that often went unnoticed by the men who surrounded them. Women at court used their beauty, wit, and intelligence to influence the political landscape, even if their influence was never openly acknowledged. They became confidants to kings and queens, advisors to powerful men, and patrons of the arts. Women like Catherine de' Medici, who rose to power as the Queen Consort of France, and Elizabeth III to the Queen of England, were able to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics and wield significant influence. These women were not mere observers of history. They were its architects, shaping the course of nations and empires. But for most women, the path to power was not so direct. It was a constant struggle to maintain some degree of control over their lives in a society that sought to strip them of it. Their resistance was not always visible or recognized by history, but it was there, in the small acts of defiance, in the quiet moments of strength, in the subtle ways they carved out space for themselves. It was in their ability to survive, despite the odds stacked against them, that their power lay. Take, for example, the women who lived through the horrors of war. While men fought on the front lines, women were left behind to manage the home front. They were responsible for ensuring that their families survived, often under the most dire circumstances. In times of war, women were called upon to take on roles that were traditionally reserved for men, acting as soldiers, nurses, and caregivers. Women like the mothers of the Revolution in France or the women who worked in factories during World War II demonstrate how women have consistently found ways to contribute to society, even when they were excluded from the official narrative. Even in times of peace, women had to find ways to survive. Marriage was often a survival strategy, a way for women to secure protection, resources, and social status. Yet, even within the confines of marriage, women found ways to assert their agency. Some women used their roles as wives and mothers to gain power and influence within their families and communities. Others resisted the pressures of marriage altogether, choosing to remain single, or even to pursue lives as religious women, where they could exercise some degree of independence. In the end, survival was not just about enduring physical hardships. It was about navigating a world that constantly sought to limit women's power and voices. For many women, survival meant finding ways to maintain their humanity in a society that dehumanized them. It meant resisting the roles that were imposed on them, even when that resistance was small, quiet, and often invisible. And in this quiet resistance, women found not only the strength to survive, but also the courage to thrive. Their stories, though often untold, are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, reminding us that even in the darkest of times, there are those who refuse to be silenced. Their legacy lives on in the lives of every woman who continues to fight for freedom, equality, and justice. In a time when the boundaries of a woman's existence were sharply drawn, when her voice was little more than a whisper in a world dominated by male authority, the notion of freedom was a distant dream. Women in the 14th to 18th centuries were expected to be silent, obedient, and subservient, their lives defined by the rigid roles society imposed upon them. But even in this environment of profound restriction, there were moments, however small, when women could carve out spaces of autonomy. These moments, often unnoticed by history, became the foundation upon which future generations would build their battles for freedom, equality, and recognition. The concept of freedom for these women was complex and layered. It was not a freedom to speak out publicly or to challenge the established order, but rather a quiet, subtle form of resistance, a resistance rooted in survival. It was the ability to endure in a world that demanded not only obedience, but absolute submission. The idea of freedom was less about grand gestures and more about finding the small cracks in the system where a woman could assert her will, her desires, and her agency, even in the most controlled of circumstances. Consider the life of women in the rural villages, where survival was the primary focus. The life expectancy in these areas was low, and the work was grueling. The men in these communities were often away for long periods, leaving the women in charge of the home and fields. In these isolated settings, women had a certain degree of autonomy. They managed the day-to-day operations of the household, made decisions regarding the crops, and ensured that the family survived. In many ways, these women were the backbone of rural life. They were not merely wives and mothers, they were the ones who kept the wheels of daily life turning. Despite their isolation and the oppressive structures around them, these women were often the decision makers in their homes. For example, women in rural villages were responsible for the preservation of food, the management of livestock, and the care of children. In some cases, they became the local healers, relying on their knowledge of herbs and natural remedies to treat the sick. This knowledge was not just practical, it was a form of power. While men were away, these women held sway in their communities, often becoming the primary figures of authority. However, this power came with significant risks. The knowledge that women held was often viewed with suspicion, especially when it went beyond what was considered acceptable by the church or the state. In a world where religion was central to every aspect of life, women who had knowledge of herbal medicine or who practiced any form of spiritual healing were often seen as witches. The fear of witches was pervasive during this time, and women who were deemed to be too knowledgeable were often accused of witchcraft. The witch hunts, which spanned several centuries, were a direct result of the fear and suspicion surrounding women who stepped outside the bounds of societal expectations. Women who lived in rural communities were often the target of witch trials, especially if they were seen as independent or uncontrolled. Many women who practiced midwifery or who had knowledge of medicine found themselves accused of witchcraft when their expertise was not recognized by the authorities. The trials were a way for society to police women's bodies and actions. Those who were accused of witchcraft were often tortured, and many were executed. The fear of this punishment kept most women in line, silencing their voices and ensuring that they stayed within the roles that had been designated for them. Yet even with the threat of witch trials hanging over their heads, women continued to assert themselves. Whether through their roles as healers, as leaders in the home, or as quiet rebels against the societal norms, these women found ways to resist the systems that sought to control them. This resistance was often not immediate or obvious, but rather a slow, simmering defiance that could take years to fully manifest. In the more privileged circles of society, where women were often married off to secure political or economic alliances, the situation was no less oppressive. Aristocratic women were expected to maintain a perfect appearance and bear children to secure the family's legacy. These marriages were often arranged without the woman's consent, and her personal desires were rarely considered. Her life was dictated by the demands of her husband and the family she married into. In these circumstances, women were often seen as mere extensions of their husband's ambitions. Yet, even in these high-stakes environments, women found ways to exercise subtle forms of power. Take, for example, the role of women in royal courts. Although they were generally kept from holding official power, many women at court used their influence behind the scenes to affect decisions. Royal women were often advisors to kings and princes, shaping policies, diplomacy, and alliances. While their official roles were limited, their influence was undeniable. Women like Catherine de' Medici, who became the queen consort of France, used their positions to shape political decisions, often acting as the political brains behind their husbands' reigns. Catherine's influence was so profound that she's often credited with securing the future of the French monarchy, even though she never officially held power. Elizabeth I of England, perhaps the most famous queen in history, navigated the complex world of royal politics with skill and precision. Though her position was undoubtedly one of immense power, she too had to navigate a world that sought to undermine her authority because of her gender. Yet, despite the constant pressure to conform to the role of a submissive female ruler, Elizabeth managed to outwit and outmaneuver her male counterparts, proving that women could hold power even in a world that refused to acknowledge their potential. While Elizabeth's rule is often held up as an example of female power, it is important to recognize that most women did not have the luxury of such positions. For many, their power was less about direct political control and more about the influence they could wield within their households, among their families, or in the smaller circles of society. Women were often the silent influencers behind great men, their voices hushed but their impact undeniable. They exercised power in the subtle manipulation of the social order, in their ability to influence their husbands, children, and other members of the household. But it was not just in royal courts or rural villages where women exercised resistance. In every sphere of society, women found ways to navigate the oppressive structures that sought to control them. Whether through art, literature, or education, women began to push the boundaries of what was acceptable. The work of women writers during this period was often ignored or dismissed, but the very act of writing was a form of rebellion. Women like Mary Wollstonecraft, whose work would become foundational to feminist thought, began to challenge the ideas of female subjugation and inequality that had been enshrined by centuries of patriarchal rule. Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792, was one of the earliest texts to argue for the intellectual and social equality of women. Her arguments were radical at the time and were met with hostility by many, but the very existence of her work marked a turning point in the struggle for women's rights. It showed that women were capable of not only resisting the confines of their roles, but also of articulating their resistance in ways that could be heard and understood. Her words, though met with resistance in her time, laid the foundation for future generations of women to continue the fight for equality and recognition. The idea of resistance for women in this period was not always about grand acts of rebellion. It was, more often than not, about survival and the subtle assertion of agency in a world that sought to erase them. Women resisted through their daily actions, through their work, their relationships, and their ability to carve out moments of freedom in an otherwise suffocating world. This quiet resistance, though often invisible, was the bedrock upon which the future movements for women's rights would be built. As we look back on the lives of these women, it becomes clear that their resistance was not just about surviving, it was about shaping the world in ways that allowed future generations to rise up and claim the freedom that had been denied to them. These women, through their quiet acts of rebellion, laid the groundwork for the world we live in today. A world where the fight for women's rights continues, and where the voices of women are finally being heard. As we continue to explore the history of women from the 14th to the 18th centuries, we begin to see more clearly how the concept of freedom was not an abstract idea, but rather a quiet, almost imperceptible force that women began to harness, even within the constraints of their limited roles. These women, whether they were peasants, aristocrats, or religious figures, found ways to resist the oppressive systems that sought to silence them. They did not always do so through overt rebellion or direct confrontation. Often, their resistance was marked by subtlety, by navigating the spaces between silence and speech, between submission and defiance. But what made their resistance so powerful was its persistence. The very act of surviving within a system that sought to crush them was, in itself, an act of resistance. At the heart of this resistance was the act of survival itself. To survive in a world where women had few rights, where their identities were submerged beneath the roles of wife and mother, was no small feat. Women lived under constant surveillance, not only by their husbands, but by society, the church, and the state. The expectations placed upon them were suffocating. They were expected to be obedient, submissive, and completely devoted to their families. There was little room for individuality, for personal expression, for dreams beyond the domestic sphere. Yet, despite these constraints, women found ways to assert themselves, to carve out spaces where they could be free, even if only for a moment. Take, for example, the women who lived in convents. While many may see convent life as a form of complete submission, for some women, it was one of the few spaces where they could find a degree of independence. The religious life provided a refuge for women who sought to escape the pressures of marriage and motherhood, though this escape was often limited by the rigid religious rules that governed these institutions. Convents offered women the opportunity to read, to write, to study, and to engage in intellectual pursuits that were otherwise denied to them. Women like Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, used their time in convents to write extensively on theology, medicine, and philosophy, producing works that were far ahead of their time. Through their intellectual contributions, these women not only challenged the dominant religious and social systems, but also paved the way for future generations to assert their intellectual and spiritual independence. But convents were not the only spaces where women resisted. In the courts of monarchs and aristocrats, women also found ways to navigate the oppressive structures of power. Although they were often kept from holding official power, women in the royal courts were not powerless. They wielded influence behind the scenes, often acting as advisors, confidants, and intermediaries. Queens like Catherine de' Medici and Elizabeth I of England demonstrated how women, even in positions of apparent subjugation, could shape the political landscape. While these women may have been constrained by the expectations of their gender, they used their positions to navigate the treacherous world of court politics and to exert influence over the decisions that shaped nations and empires. The lives of these royal women were often marked by tension between duty and desire, between submission and power. Elizabeth I, for example, had to navigate a delicate balance between her role as queen and her role as a woman in a society that expected her to marry and produce an heir. Her decision to remain unmarried, to take on the mantle of the Virgin Queen, was both a political strategy and a personal rebellion. It allowed her to maintain authority over her reign and to remain in control of her political destiny. At the same time, it forced her to operate within the constraints imposed on her gender. She could never fully escape the limitations of her sex, but she found ways to use them to her advantage, making her one of the most successful and influential monarchs in history. Yet for most women, the exercise of power was not so grand or visible. The vast majority of women lived their lives within the confines of marriage and motherhood. They were expected to bear children, manage households, and be the quiet, supportive figures behind their husband's success. While this role was limiting, it also offered women a certain degree of control over the private sphere. Women were the keepers of the home, the managers of their family's day-to-day life. They had authority within their homes, even if that authority was rarely acknowledged outside the walls of the household. Women often made decisions about how their children were raised, how money was spent, and how the household was run. These small acts of power, though invisible, were vital to the functioning of society. In addition to managing the household, women in these domestic roles were also responsible for maintaining the emotional well-being of their families. They were the caregivers, the emotional anchors of their homes, and they often had to navigate the complex emotional lives of their husbands and children. Their role was not just one of physical labor, but of emotional labor, as they were expected to provide care and comfort in a world that often left them with little room for self-care. The emotional labor of women in this period was rarely recognized, but it was essential to the survival of families and communities. Women were the glue that held society together, even if their contributions were invisible. The power of women in the domestic sphere was also evident in their roles as religious figures. Women in the medieval and early modern periods were often expected to adhere to strict religious codes, but many found ways to express their spirituality in ways that were both personal and political. Religious orders like the Beguinese allowed women to live lives of devotion without the constraints of traditional marriage or convent life. These women were able to engage in charitable work, educate others, and practice their faith while maintaining a degree of independence that was rare for women at the time. Their religious devotion, while often constrained by societal norms, became a form of resistance. It was a way for women to assert their autonomy in a world that sought to control every aspect of their lives. As time passed and the centuries wore on, the resistance of women grew more visible and more vocal. The rise of the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries provided new intellectual and philosophical frameworks that allowed women to articulate their desires for freedom, equality, and recognition. Writers like Mary Wollstonecraft began to challenge the patriarchal structures that had long defined women's lives, arguing for the intellectual and social equality of women. Her work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792, laid the groundwork for the feminist movements that would follow. Wollstonecraft's arguments were radical for their time, but they were an essential part of the intellectual shift that would eventually lead to the recognition of women's rights in the modern era. Wollstonecraft's writings, along with the work of other early feminists, marked a turning point in the struggle for women's rights. The intellectual and philosophical debates that emerged in the Enlightenment period provided a platform for women to challenge the accepted norms and to demand recognition of their rights as human beings. While the road to equality was still long and fraught with obstacles, the writings of women like Wollstonecraft and their ability to articulate their resistance created a foundation upon which future generations would continue to build. However, the story of women's resistance did not end with the Enlightenment. The fight for women's rights continued to evolve, taking on new forms in response to changing political, social, and economic conditions. The quiet resistance that had marked women's lives for centuries gave way to more visible and direct forms of activism, from suffrage movements to labor protests to the fight for reproductive rights. The legacy of the women who fought quietly, often without recognition, continued to resonate in these movements. The resistance of women during the 14th to 18th centuries was not always loud or obvious, but it was relentless. Women found ways to assert themselves in every sphere of life, whether in the household, the church, the court, or the streets. They resisted through their work, their relationships, their knowledge, and their voices. Though their stories were often silenced, their contributions laid the groundwork for the future struggles for equality and freedom. The resilience of these women, their quiet acts of rebellion, and their persistence in the face of overwhelming odds have shaped the world we live in today, and their legacy continues to inspire the fight for justice and equality for women everywhere. In the lives of women between the 14th and 18th centuries, survival was often the only form of resistance they could afford. They were born into a world that demanded their submission, their silence, and their compliance. The systems that governed their lives, whether religious, political, or familial, were designed to ensure that their voices remained hushed. Yet, despite this overwhelming force, women managed to navigate these oppressive structures in ways that were not only creative, but incredibly resilient. Their lives, though often overlooked in historical records, were marked by small, yet powerful acts of defiance. These acts were not grand gestures or public rebellions, but rather subtle forms of resistance that allowed them to survive, and in some cases, even thrive in a world that sought to keep them invisible. It is important to understand that the struggle for survival was not simply physical for women of this time. It was intellectual, emotional, and social. Women faced immense pressure to conform to rigid expectations from the moment they were born. The dominant belief that a woman's primary role was to be a wife and mother had deep roots in religious teachings, societal norms, and legal systems. This idea was reinforced at every turn, from the church to the family unit, where women were seen as secondary to men. The expectation that women should marry young, bear children, and focus their energies on running a household left little room for self-expression or personal development. Take, for example, the societal structure that placed women under the guardianship of male figures. From the moment a woman was born, her life was largely defined by the men around her, her father, then her husband. Even her legal rights, such as owning property or managing finances, were severely limited. In most societies during this time, women had no legal identity apart from the men they were connected to. If a woman had to navigate the world alone due to the death of a father or husband, she was often left in a precarious situation. Her worth was defined by her ability to fulfill her role as a wife and mother. If she failed to do so, she could be cast aside or labeled as a failure, or worse, branded as an outsider, an anomaly in a world built on gendered roles. However, within these narrow confines, women still managed to assert their presence. One of the most profound ways women navigated these restrictions was through the role they played in the household. While men may have been the figureheads of the family, women were the backbone. They ran the day-to-day operations of their homes, managed household finances, and made decisions about how to raise children. In some cases, especially among the rural or working classes, women even became the financial providers, running small businesses or acting as informal traders. This was a subtle form of resistance, women making their own decisions, managing resources, and shaping the future of their families, despite the lack of legal recognition. Even more remarkable was the role of women in education and intellectual life during these centuries. And while access to formal education was restricted for most women, they still found ways to learn, to read, and to write. Women who were fortunate enough to be part of more privileged families had access to the early forms of education, often from tutors or within convents. The ability to read and write, although rare, was a form of power. It allowed women to express their thoughts, to communicate beyond their immediate surroundings, and to participate in the intellectual movements of their time. For example, women like Christine de Pizan, a 14th century writer and philosopher, used their education to challenge the prevailing social norms. In her most famous work, The Book of the City of Ladies, Christine de Pizan created a space where women could be seen as equal to men in intellect and moral worth. She wrote extensively on the rights of women, challenging the misogynistic views that were prevalent in her time. Though her work was not widely recognized during her life, her ideas paved the way for later feminist thought. Christine de Pizan's work was one of the few from this period that directly confronted the injustices women faced, and her legacy continues to inspire feminist writers and scholars today. While the intellectual contributions of women were often dismissed or ignored by the male-dominated academic world, many women found ways to make their voices heard. These intellectual women were pioneers in their own right, using their writing and knowledge to challenge and resist the restrictions placed on them. Women like Hildegard of Bingen, who not only wrote about theology but also studied medicine, music, and natural sciences, defied the conventions of her time. She became one of the most celebrated figures in medieval Europe, not for her obedience to societal norms, but for her ability to transcend them. Beyond intellectual and domestic resistance, women also exerted influence through the arts. Female artists, musicians, and performers were able to navigate patriarchal society by using their talents in ways that gave them a platform. Women like the 16th century composer and musician Isabella Leonarda created lasting works that continue to be celebrated for their creativity and depth. Women were able to use music, literature, and art as a form of personal expression, an outlet for their creativity and emotions in a world that had no space for these things. These arts were not only a way to assert independence, but also a way for women to communicate their feelings, their frustrations, and their desires, often in ways that were less likely to be censored or dismissed. The suppression of women's voices through the church was also an enormous factor in their lives. The church was one of the most powerful institutions during the medieval and early modern periods, and it played a major role in reinforcing the notion that women were subordinate to men. Women were often told that their place was in the home and that their worth was defined by their ability to serve their husbands and raise children. Those who dared to step outside these boundaries were often accused of witchcraft or other deviant behaviors. The church used its power to control women's bodies, from dictating their sexuality to enforcing strict codes of conduct. Yet, even within the rigid confines of the church, women managed to carve out spaces of resistance. Some became nuns or mystics, finding solace in their relationship with God, and using religious devotion as a means of self-expression. For example, the mystic Teresa of Avila, a Spanish nun, became one of the most influential religious figures of the 16th century, known for her writings on spirituality and reform. She used her religious position to speak out about the injustices women faced and to create spaces for other women to find their voices. One of the most subtle yet powerful forms of resistance came through the simple act of surviving. Women who endured the hardships of childbirth, marriage, and the limitations placed upon them managed to create lives that, though not ideal, allowed them to assert some measure of control over their circumstances. They resisted not through overt rebellion, but through endurance, by outlasting the systems that sought to keep them quiet. This silent rebellion was often invisible, but it was effective. Women resisted the patriarchy, not by breaking the laws of society, but by living within them while simultaneously subverting them. The sheer determination to survive in such a restrictive world was an act of resistance in itself. It was a testament to the strength of women who, despite being constantly oppressed, found ways to continue. Even though their lives were shaped by forces beyond their control, they managed to assert themselves through small acts of rebellion, whether in the home, the workplace, or through intellectual pursuits. In a world that often overlooked their contributions, women were still able to leave their mark. It was in their quiet acts of defiance that their true power lay. Their legacy is one that is often hidden from the history books, but remains alive in the ways that women continue to challenge and resist oppressive systems today. As we continue to look back on the stories of these women, we see that their struggles were not in vain. They laid the groundwork for the social, political, and intellectual changes that would come centuries later. Their survival, their resilience, and their resistance were the first steps in the long journey toward the recognition of women's rights. And in each of their stories, we find echoes of the battles that women continue to fight today for equality, justice, and recognition. The role of women in society during the 14th to 18th centuries was defined by limitations, expectations, and oppression. Yet, within these constraints, women began to subtly push back, carving spaces of autonomy where they could express themselves and challenge the dominant structures that sought to control their lives. The paradox of this period lies in the fact that, despite being marginalized and silenced, women exhibited incredible resilience and ingenuity. Their acts of resistance were not always dramatic or visible, but they were no less significant. Their quiet defiance, often unnoticed by the world around them, helped lay the foundation for future generations of women to rise up and demand equality, rights, and recognition. While women were largely confined to the domestic sphere, it was within this very space that they wielded considerable power. The home was the site of most women's work, and while it may have been an oppressive environment in many ways, it also provided opportunities for influence. A woman's role as a mother, wife, and caregiver placed her at the heart of the family, making her essential to its survival. This responsibility gave her a level of control over household decisions and the welfare of the children. In many cases, the survival of the family, particularly in rural or isolated communities, depended heavily on the woman's ability to manage resources, make decisions about farming, and maintain relationships with the wider community. In these roles, women often became the key figures in the family's day-to-day operations. Their work went far beyond basic housekeeping. They were the economic engines of their households. Women managed finances, maintained the household, took care of the sick, and in some cases, ran small businesses. In rural settings, women frequently handled the production of food, weaving, and other essential crafts. By ensuring that the family's basic needs were met, they allowed their husbands and fathers to engage in activities outside the home. Despite their lack of formal recognition, these women were indispensable to the functioning of society. For example, in medieval European villages, women often worked alongside their husbands, assisting with agriculture and animal husbandry. When their husbands were away for extended periods, women would be left to care for the farm, manage livestock, and provide for the family's survival. Their labor, though invisible and undervalued, was often the primary means by which families maintained their livelihoods. Women's capacity to navigate such challenges without formal authority demonstrates their resourcefulness and their ability to carve out a sphere of influence within the limits imposed by society. Even when faced with the daily struggles of raising children and managing households, women were able to create and preserve a sense of community. In rural areas, women formed close-knit support networks. They shared knowledge, helped one another with childcare, and provided emotional and practical support. These networks of women, while largely informal and unrecognized by the broader society, were crucial to their survival. In times of famine, disease, or personal crisis, these women offered the kind of solidarity that was otherwise absent from their lives. These informal bonds provided not only survival strategies, but also a sense of belonging and collective strength. However, for many women, survival was not simply about managing the household. It was about holding onto their identity, their voice, and their sense of self in a world that often tried to erase them. In a society that excluded women from formal education, from public roles, and from meaningful participation in the political sphere, women found other ways to assert their existence. While women were discouraged from engaging in public life, their intellectual and spiritual lives became a form of resistance. Education, while rare for most women, became a key area where some women found a path toward greater freedom. Take, for example, the lives of women in religious communities. Convents, while still highly restrictive in many ways, offered women a place where they could cultivate their intellect and spirituality outside the constraints of marriage. Women who entered religious orders often found a degree of autonomy that was unavailable to them in the secular world. They could read, write, study theology, and engage in intellectual discourse, activities that were otherwise denied to most women. The convent became a space of refuge and intellectual resistance. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, is one of the most notable examples of women using religious life to assert intellectual independence. She wrote extensively on medicine, theology, and the natural world, producing works that were ahead of her time. Her contributions to music, philosophy, and healing were groundbreaking, and her work influenced many in the centuries that followed. Hildegard's legacy is a testament to the ways women used the constraints of their time to create lasting change, even in the most restrictive environments. In addition to religious life, some women sought to assert their intellectual independence by engaging in the arts. Music, poetry, and literature became avenues for self-expression and intellectual engagement. Women like Isabella d'Este, a noblewoman in 16th century Italy, became influential patrons of the arts, supporting and commissioning works by artists, musicians, and writers. While their positions were not without limitations, these women used their resources and positions to challenge the boundaries of their time. Through their patronage, they created spaces where art and culture flourished, thus contributing to the broader intellectual and cultural movements of their periods. Yet even in these spaces of privilege, the road to intellectual and personal freedom was fraught with challenges. While women like Hildegard of Bingen and Isabella d'Este were able to exert influence, their efforts were exceptional. For most women, access to education and intellectual life was limited to the domestic realm. They were taught domestic skills, such as sewing, cooking, and managing a household, but were discouraged from pursuing intellectual endeavors. The prevailing belief was that women's primary role was to be a wife and mother, and anything outside of that role was deemed unnecessary or dangerous. Despite these societal barriers, women like Christine de Pizan in the 14th century and Mary Wollstonecraft in the 18th century began to challenge the notion that women's primary purpose was domestic. Christine de Pizan's The Book of the City of Ladies was one of the first feminist texts calling for the recognition of women's intellectual abilities and their right to education. Similarly, Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman argued for women's equality in all aspects of society, from education to politics. These works, while controversial in their time, paved the way for the feminist movements that would follow. Christine de Pizan and Mary Wollstonecraft were not just writers, they were intellectual warriors. They fought against the entrenched beliefs that confined women to narrow roles and created frameworks for future generations of women to challenge these limitations. Their work remains foundational to feminist thought, and their voices echo through history as examples of intellectual courage. Yet, the majority of women in the 14th to 18th centuries did not have the privilege of intellectual engagement or the luxury of challenging societal norms. For many, survival meant accepting their role within the constraints of marriage and motherhood. The very act of surviving, day in and day out, was itself a form of resistance. The ability to endure, to live in a world where every aspect of your existence was controlled by others, required extraordinary strength and resilience. It is easy to overlook the quiet victories, the moments when women, faced with insurmountable odds, managed to push back against the forces that sought to control them. It is in these quiet moments that the true power of women's resistance lies. Women resisted not only through rebellion, but through endurance, through the small acts of defiance that, over time, built the foundation for larger movements. As we look back on the lives of these women, we begin to see that their resistance was not about grand gestures. It was about the small, everyday acts of survival that allowed them to retain their sense of identity and autonomy in a world that sought to erase them. Whether through intellectual pursuit, artistic expression, or the management of their households, these women found ways to navigate and resist the oppressive systems that sought to control their lives. Their legacy continues to resonate today as we build upon their small victories to create a more just and equal world. Their stories are reminders of the power of resilience, of the quiet forms of resistance that can ultimately change the world. In a world where women were often relegated to the shadows of history, their voices silenced, their ambitions crushed beneath the weight of societal expectations, the struggle for agency was a quiet but persistent force. The lives of women in the 14th to 18th centuries were shaped by a complex web of social, religious, and cultural norms that sought to restrict their movement, their voices, and their very identities. Yet, despite these overwhelming forces, women found ways to resist. They resisted not by open rebellion, but through subtle forms of defiance, through survival, endurance, and the reclamation of their own voices, often in the most unlikely of spaces. The idea of freedom for women in this time period was not the freedom we understand today. It was not the right to vote, to own property, or to participate in politics. Rather, it was the freedom to exist as an individual, to have agency in their own lives, to express themselves beyond the roles of wife, mother, and servant. The vast majority of women, especially those from lower social classes, were trapped in a world where their worth was measured only by their ability to serve others. Their bodies were controlled, their voices silenced, and their roles strictly defined. Marriage and motherhood were not just expected. They were the only roles allowed, and any deviation from this script was met with suspicion, scorn, or worse. However, the story of these women is not one of mere survival. It is a story of quiet, often invisible resistance. Women managed to carve out spaces of autonomy, to assert themselves, even if those moments were fleeting. The resistance came in the form of small acts. A woman challenging her husband's authority, a mother resisting the demands of a church that told her how to raise her children, or a young girl defying the expectation that she should marry at an early age. These acts of defiance were not always visible, but they were profound, and they laid the groundwork for the feminist movements that would come centuries later. Take, for example, the role of women in the church. While women were generally excluded from positions of power within the clergy, they still found ways to engage with religious life and to express their spiritual beliefs. Nuns, in particular, often had more freedom than their married counterparts, as they were able to devote themselves to religious study and practice without the constraints of marriage and motherhood. Many women in convents were able to become scholars, writers, and healers, contributing to the intellectual and cultural life of the time. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, is one of the most famous examples of a woman who used her position in the church to assert her authority. She was a visionary and a polymath, writing theology, medicine, music, and even pioneering a system of natural history. Despite the fact that she was a woman in a male-dominated religious hierarchy, Hildegard's contributions were widely recognized in her time, and she is still remembered as one of the most important intellectuals of the medieval period. Her ability to transcend the limitations imposed on her by both gender and religion was an act of defiance in itself. She showed that a woman, even within the constraints of the church, could wield intellectual and spiritual authority. Hildegard's story, however, was far from unique. Many other women used their position in religious life to challenge the expectations placed upon them. Some nuns became influential figures in their communities, acting as healers, educators, and spiritual guides. In some cases, women were able to use their knowledge of medicine and healing to provide care for the sick, filling roles that were usually reserved for male doctors. In a time when medical knowledge was limited and often steeped in superstition, women's knowledge of herbs, natural remedies, and healing techniques was not only practical but powerful. For many women, the act of healing was a form of resistance, a way to assert their autonomy over their own bodies and the bodies of others. But religious life was not the only arena in which women resisted. Women in the courts of Europe, though often bound by the same expectations of marriage and motherhood, were able to wield power in more subtle ways. Aristocratic women were often married off for political reasons, but many found ways to exert influence behind the scenes. Women like Catherine de' Medici, the Queen of France, and Elizabeth I of England used their positions to shape political decisions, maintain power, and protect their families. While they were often restricted by their gender, these women found ways to play the political game, using their intelligence, wit, and strategic alliances to influence the course of history. Catherine de' Medici, for example, used her political acumen to become one of the most powerful women in 16th century Europe. Although her marriage to Henry II of France was arranged to secure political alliances, Catherine became a key political figure in France after her husband's death. She was deeply involved in court politics, influencing the decisions of her sons and playing a major role in shaping the policies of the French monarchy. While her power was not openly acknowledged, she effectively ruled the kingdom, often from behind the scenes. Her story is a testament to the ways in which women in the aristocracy could wield influence, even if they were not given the official titles or recognition. Similarly, Elizabeth I of England navigated the treacherous waters of court politics to become one of the most successful monarchs in history. Despite the constant pressure to marry and produce an heir, Elizabeth remained unmarried, a decision that allowed her to maintain her political independence. Her reign, known as the Elizabethan era, was marked by great cultural, political, and military success. Her ability to navigate the expectations placed upon her as a woman and to turn those very expectations to her advantage was a remarkable act of resistance. But for the vast majority of women, the story was not one of political power or intellectual accomplishment. It was a story of survival in a world that offered little in terms of personal freedom. Women were often forced to find ways to carve out small spaces of autonomy within the confines of marriage and motherhood. For many, the ability to manage their household, to raise their children, and to support their husbands was the extent of their power. Yet, even within these roles, women found ways to exert influence. They managed the household finances, decided how resources were allocated, and played a central role in shaping the upbringing of their children. And while this power was often invisible, it was no less significant. The survival of the family, and in many cases, the survival of entire communities, depended on the work and decisions of women. In rural areas, women were often responsible for managing the farm, caring for animals, and producing food. In some cases, they ran small businesses or worked as traders, engaging in economic activity that allowed them to support their families and assert a degree of financial independence. In these small acts of defiance, women resisted the limitations placed upon them and demonstrated their ability to survive and even thrive in a world that sought to keep them confined. One of the most poignant forms of resistance during this period was the act of motherhood. And while motherhood was often imposed on women as a duty, it was also a role that allowed them to exert influence over the next generation. By raising children, women shaped the future of society, passing on knowledge, values, and traditions. Mothers were the first teachers, and their influence over their children was profound. In a society that sought to silence women, motherhood became one of the few avenues through which women could leave a lasting impact. The power of a mother's love, guidance, and care created the foundations for the next generation, making it one of the most powerful acts of resistance in a world that sought to render women invisible. The legacy of these women, though often overlooked by history, is profound. Their acts of resistance, whether through intellectual pursuits, political influence, or the quiet power of survival, laid the groundwork for the feminist movements that would follow. The courage of women like Hildegard of Bingen, Catherine de' Medici, and Elizabeth I, as well as the quiet strength of countless others, continues to inspire the fight for women's rights today. The very fact that they managed to navigate and resist the oppressive systems of their time is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and their legacy continues to echo through the generations. The resistance of these women, though often invisible, was crucial to the shaping of a world where women's voices are no longer silenced. The 14th to 18th centuries were periods marked by profound hardship for women. The social structures of the time were built upon rigid, patriarchal systems that restricted their agency, relegated them to roles as wives, mothers, and caretakers, and dictated the very essence of their identity. In such a world, survival was a form of resistance, and survival required remarkable resilience. Women faced oppression not only in the form of social roles, but also in the form of legal restrictions, religious constraints, and economic limitations. They were constantly told that their value lay solely in their ability to serve others. But despite the overwhelming weight of these societal expectations, They pushed back in their own quiet, often invisible ways. To survive, women often had to manipulate and navigate the expectations placed upon them with an incredible degree of intelligence, cunning, and emotional strength. While many women were trapped in domestic roles, others found small ways to assert themselves in the spaces that society had carved out for them. They found ways to thrive within the confines of these roles, subtly resisting the systems that sought to silence their voices and limit their potential. Take, for example, the way women in rural communities found ways to maintain authority over their households. These women were the true architects of survival. In farming families, women were not just caregivers, but active participants in the economic survival of their families. They managed the production of food, organized labor, and ensured that the household remained functional even when their husbands were away for long periods. These women had the knowledge to keep the farm running, maintain relationships with neighbors, and ensure that children were properly cared for and educated. Their work in these small, seemingly invisible domains was an act of defiance. They were making decisions that affected the entire family, often without official recognition or approval. In addition to their role in the household, women in rural areas often wielded significant power through their knowledge of medicinal herbs and natural remedies. This knowledge was passed down through generations, often in secret, as it was viewed with suspicion by the medical authorities of the time, who were predominantly male. Women acted as healers in their communities, providing care for the sick and injured and offering remedies for ailments that were otherwise untreatable. In an era when the medical establishment was poorly equipped and often ineffective, women's knowledge of herbal medicine was indispensable. This made women indispensable in rural communities, as they were the ones who kept their families healthy and alive. However, this power came with its own set of risks. Women who were seen as too knowledgeable, too independent, or too influential often found themselves accused of witchcraft. The witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries were largely a response to women who challenged the norms of society, whether through their intellectual abilities, their political actions, or their knowledge of medicine. These women were often accused of being in league with the devil, of using their knowledge for malevolent purposes, and were subjected to horrific trials and executions. The fear of being accused of witchcraft was a powerful tool used by the authorities to keep women in check, ensuring that they stayed within the confines of their socially prescribed roles. Yet, even with the constant threat of accusation hanging over their heads, women continued to practice their healing arts. They passed down their knowledge in secret, often gathering in small groups where they could share information without fear of retribution. This act of defiance, continuing to heal, continuing to use their knowledge despite the risks, was an extraordinary form of resistance. By providing care for their communities, these women were not only asserting their power over their own lives, but also resisting a society that sought to limit their autonomy and suppress their knowledge. In the more privileged circles, women also found ways to assert their authority and influence. Although women in royal and aristocratic circles were often constrained by the expectation to marry for political gain, many used their positions to exert considerable power behind the scenes. Women like Catherine de' Medici, who served as regent for her son, Charles IX of France, and Elizabeth I of England, who skillfully navigated the complexities of court politics, used their intelligence and political savvy to influence the decisions of their kingdoms. While their power was often indirect, they wielded it effectively, shaping the course of history from behind the throne. These women were more than mere consorts. They were active political agents, making crucial decisions about their country's futures. Catherine de' Medici's political maneuvering in France, for example, was crucial to maintaining the power of the Medici family and stabilizing France during a time of great religious and political turmoil. Although she was a woman in a male-dominated political world, Catherine used her knowledge of court politics, her extensive network of alliances, and her sharp political mind to navigate the dangerous waters of French politics. She became one of the most powerful women of the Renaissance, and her ability to influence the course of French history was unparalleled. Elizabeth I of England, similarly, used her gender to her advantage. Though she was often pressured to marry and produce an heir, Elizabeth understood that her unmarried status gave her political leverage. By remaining single, she was able to avoid the influence of a husband, giving her the ability to rule independently. Her reign, known as the Elizabethan era, was one of the most prosperous periods in English history, marked by flourishing arts, successful naval victories, and the establishment of England as a global power. Elizabeth's ability to navigate the politics of court and rule a nation as a woman remains a powerful example of how women in power, even when constrained by their gender, can effect profound change. However, not all women in these times had the privilege of political power or intellectual freedom. For many, survival was simply about making it through each day, coping with the demands of marriage, childbirth, and domestic labor. Women in the lower classes had little recourse when it came to escaping abusive marriages, and the law generally sided with husbands who had control over their wives' lives. Women who could not bear children or who failed to produce male heirs were often viewed as failures, and their value was diminished. In such a world, where a woman's worth was determined by her ability to bear children and maintain a household, the idea of freedom, of having a say in one's own life, was nearly unimaginable. But even in these constrained circumstances, women found ways to resist. Some managed to break free of abusive marriages, or at least exert some control over their own lives. Women who lived in urban areas or worked as servants in wealthier households sometimes found opportunities to carve out their own spaces. They formed networks of support with other women, helping each other navigate the challenges they faced. In some cases, these women were able to build small businesses or find other means of income, asserting some degree of financial independence. While these women were often invisible in the historical record, their lives were no less important. The survival strategies they employed, the ways they resisted their subjugation, are the very foundation upon which later feminist movements would build. The quiet defiance that characterized their lives, whether through domestic labor, intellectual pursuits, or simple acts of survival, was a form of resistance in itself. The power of these women lies not in the grand narratives written about them, but in the subtle, often overlooked acts that allowed them to push back against the systems that sought to control them. Their stories, though not always recorded in the history books, are essential to understanding the long history of women's struggle for autonomy and equality. These women, in their own ways, carved out spaces of power and influence in a world that sought to erase them. And in doing so, they laid the groundwork for the generations of women who would come after them, women who would continue the fight for equality, for recognition, and for the right to live their lives on their own terms. In every small act of survival, every whisper of defiance, these women created a legacy that endures to this day. Their resistance, though often invisible, was the quiet force that shaped the world they lived in and continues to shape the world today. The history of women's resistance is not one of grand revolutions or loud protests, but of everyday acts of survival and subtle acts of defiance, small steps toward freedom that have made all the difference. The lives of women in the 14th to 18th centuries were marked by a complex dance between compliance and resistance. They existed in a world where every aspect of their lives was shaped by forces beyond their control, forces that dictated their worth, their voice, and their very existence. Yet, within this vast structure of oppression, women found ways to carve out moments of autonomy, to express themselves, and to subtly defy the systems that sought to contain them. Their resistance, though not always visible, was a quiet yet powerful force that began to shift the boundaries of possibility for future generations. In the midst of the suffocating control exerted over women's lives, one of the most profound forms of resistance was the act of survival itself. The very fact that women endured in a world that demanded their obedience, often at the cost of their physical and emotional well-being, was a testament to their resilience. These women, despite being constantly told that their value lay solely in their ability to serve others, whether as wives, mothers, or servants, pushed back against this narrative by continuing to live and assert themselves in the spaces available to them. They did not simply endure. They found ways to survive, to thrive, and to leave behind legacies that continue to influence our world today. To understand the depth of this resistance, it's essential to examine the way women navigated the roles that society demanded of them. Women in the 14th to 18th centuries were often confined to domestic spaces, where they were expected to bear children, manage households, and support their husbands. These roles, while limiting, were also places where women exerted power. The home, despite being a site of patriarchal control, became the arena where women could influence their family's survival and well-being. In rural communities especially, women were not merely caretakers but the backbone of the household. Their labor was essential to the family's survival, as they were often responsible for growing food, raising livestock, managing finances, and ensuring the health of all household members. In these settings, women demonstrated incredible ingenuity and resilience. They used their knowledge of herbs, food preservation, and domestic skills to keep their families alive. This knowledge, which was passed down through generations, was not only practical but often empowered women to become healers, midwives, and even spiritual guides within their community. While men might have been seen as the heads of households, women were the ones who maintained the social fabric of rural life, ensuring that the needs of their families were met. However, this form of power was fraught with risks. In many cases, women who held knowledge outside the prescribed norms, such as herbal remedies or spiritual practices, were at risk of being accused of witchcraft. The witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries were, in part, a response to women who resisted the boundaries imposed on them by engaging in forms of knowledge and practice that were considered dangerous by the authorities. Women who were seen as too independent or who held power through their knowledge were often labeled as witches, subjected to torture and executed. But even in the face of this immense danger, women continued to assert their knowledge. The survival of these women was not only physical but intellectual. They passed down secrets of healing, of maintaining life, in defiance of the systems that sought to silence them. These women, often working in isolation or secrecy, embodied the subtle but profound resistance to the oppressive structures that defined their lives. Their very existence was an act of rebellion against the gender norms of their time. Meanwhile, women in aristocratic and royal circles found their own ways to navigate the oppressive systems they were born into. While their roles were often more public, the constraints they faced were just as rigid. Women were still seen as property, their marriages arranged to ensure political alliances or to strengthen family power. Their value was often tied to their ability to produce heirs and secure the family's legacy. Yet these women were not mere pawns in the games of politics. They wielded their influence behind the scenes, shaping the political landscape through intelligence, charm, and strategic alliances. Consider women like Catherine de' Medici, who served as the queen consort of Henry II of France and later as the regent for her sons. Catherine was instrumental in shaping French politics during a time of religious strife. Although her position was that of a woman in a patriarchal world, she demonstrated exceptional political acumen. Her influence over her sons, particularly during their reigns, allowed her to shape the future of France. Despite the fact that her power was often exercised behind closed doors, Catherine de' Medici's legacy as a political force is undeniable. Similarly, Elizabeth I of England used her gender to her advantage, refusing to marry and thus maintaining control over her reign. Her decision to remain unmarried, earning her the title of the Virgin Queen, was a political move that allowed her to hold absolute power without the influence of a husband. Elizabeth was able to successfully navigate the complex web of court politics, foreign diplomacy, and internal rebellion. Under her reign, England became a dominant power in Europe, and her legacy as one of the greatest monarchs in English history is still felt today. Both Catherine and Elizabeth demonstrated that women, even within the most rigid of societal constraints, could exert power and influence. Yet, even beyond these more prominent examples, women in the 14th to 18th centuries found ways to challenge the boundaries set before them. In many cases, the resistance was quieter but no less significant. Women, often denied formal education, found ways to learn and contribute intellectually. Whether through writing, art, or patronage, they left a mark on history that would have otherwise gone unnoticed. Women like Christine de Pizan, a 14th century French poet and philosopher, used her pen to challenge the misogynistic ideologies of her time. Her work, The Book of the City of Ladies, argued for the intellectual equality of women, and is considered one of the first feminist texts in history. Through her writing, Christine de Pizan was able to create space for women to be recognized not only as wives and mothers, but as thinkers and creators. In the world of the arts, women like Isabella d'Este, a 16th century Italian noblewoman, used their wealth and influence to become patrons of the arts. Isabella was instrumental in fostering the careers of painters, sculptors, and musicians. By creating an environment where art could flourish, she not only contributed to the cultural landscape of her time, but also challenged the gendered norms that restricted women's access to cultural and intellectual spheres. But it wasn't just women from the elite classes who were resisting. It was also those from the lower classes who found ways to assert themselves. Women who worked as servants, shopkeepers, or artisans played a crucial role in the economic survival of their communities. They were often the backbone of cities and towns, running businesses, producing goods, and maintaining the flow of commerce. Despite their lack of recognition and the often grueling nature of their work, these women made substantial contributions to their societies. Their resistance was not about grand political movements, but about finding ways to thrive in an environment that sought to keep them invisible. In the domestic sphere, women's subtle acts of resistance were often tied to the management of their homes. Women who successfully negotiated their husbands' expectations or managed family finances were asserting their authority in ways that allowed them to maintain some control over their lives. Even within the constraints of marriage, women found ways to influence the direction of their families. Whether through managing household budgets, making decisions about the education of children, or maintaining the emotional health of their families, women exercised power in ways that were often invisible but essential. This story of resistance and survival is not just about women in the past, but about the ways their legacy continues to shape the world today. The quiet resistance of these women, whether in the form of intellectual contributions, political influence, or domestic authority, was instrumental in paving the way for the feminist movements of the 19th and 20th centuries. It is through their struggles, their endurance, and their subtle defiance that women today are able to stand on the shoulders of giants, fighting for equality, autonomy, and the right to be heard. The quiet, invisible forms of resistance practiced by these women laid the foundation for the larger, more visible movements that would follow. Their courage, though often hidden from the pages of history, continues to inspire women across the world today. As we look back on their lives, we realize that their resistance was not just about rejecting the roles imposed on them, it was about creating new possibilities. Their struggles were not in vain. They helped to transform the very fabric of society, demonstrating that even in the most oppressive circumstances, women could find ways to assert their power, to carve out their own spaces, and to leave a legacy that continues to shape the world.